In the summer of 1991, an ordinary day turned into a night Marino one could forget. A young girl vanished without a trace from her neighborhood, snatched away in a way that shook her entire community. For nearly 2 decades, her fate remained a haunting mystery. Families prayed, investigators searched, but answers refused to come nothing after 18 years of silence. A shocking breakthrough turned everything upside down. What was found would rewrite history and shock the entire world. This is a story you won't believe, but you need to hear. It was June 10th, 1991, and the air carried the crisp promise of summer vacation. 11-year-old J.C. Lee Duggar pulled on her favorite outfit, a complete ensemble of pink from head to toe. Pink was her color, the one that made her feel confident and happy. Her mother, Terry, had already left for work at the print shop, leaving J.C. to make her way to the school bus stop just as she had countless times before. The house felt different that morning, though no one could have predicted why. Carl Poyne, her stepfather, watched from the window as J.C. walked up the hill against traffic. Her pink clothes a bright spot against the mountain landscape. Myers was supposed to be safe. That's why Terry had moved definitely here from Los Angeles County, to escape the dangers of city life. Rural community south of Lake Tahoe felt like the perfect place to raise children, where neighbors knew each other and children could walk to school without fear. But safety is often an illusion Jackie had made it halfway up the hill when she noticed the gray car had slowed as it approached her. As she thought nothing of it at first, drivers often stopped to ask for directions. In their small mountain community, she was a helpful child, the kind who would point tourists toward the lake or tell them where to find the nearest gas station. Car pulled alongside her, and through the rolled-down window she could see the driver clearly. He looked ordinary, enough middle-aged, unremarkable. What she couldn't see was the device in his hand, one that would change everything in an instant. From his vantage point at the house, Carl Poyne witnessed something that would haunt him forever. He saw the gray car make a U-turn at the bus stop where G waited. He saw figures moving frantically inside the vehicle. He saw his stepdaughter being forced into that car. Carl grabbed his bicycle and pedaled furiously after them, his heart pounding with terror and desperation. But Abba's cycle was no match for a car, and within moments, the gray vehicle had disappeared down the winding mountain roads, carrying G into a nightmare that would last 18 years. The school bus arrived at its usual time, but G wasn't there. Her classmates, who had also witnessed the abduction, could only watch in shock as their bus driver waited and then finally drove away. The pink-clad girl, who should have been laughing with her friends, was instead beginning a journey into darkness that no child should ever endure. But what had really happened in those crucial moments? Who was behind the wheel of that gray car? And why had they chosen the driver of the gray car? Was Philip Craig Gerio, a 40-year-old man whose life had been a steady descent into darkness. Born in Pittsburgh, California in 1951, Philip had once been described by his father as a good boy, but a motorcycle accident in his teens had changed everything, leading him down a path of drug abuse and increasing sinister behavior. What Jackie couldn't know as she approached that car was that she was looking at a convicted kidnapper and rapist. 15 years earlier, in 1976, Philip had committed a horrific crime that should have kept him locked away forever. He had kidnapped 25-year-old Catherine Calloway in South Lake Tahoe, the very same area where G now lived. Parallels were chilling. Philip had taken Catherine to a warehouse in Reno, Nevada, where he held her for over 5 hours, subjecting her to unspeakable horrors. Only a stroke of luck, a police officer noticing his car and investigating, had saved Catherine's life. Philip was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison, but the system had failed. Despite his 50-year sentence, Philip had been released after serving only 11 years. He was now on parole, living in Antioch, California, with his wife Nancy, a woman he had met while incarcerated. C. Bonagrat had been visiting her uncle, another prisoner, when she encountered Philip. Their prison romance had bloomed into a marriage in 1981, but it was a union built on manipulation and shared darkness. The couple lived in the home of Philip's elderly mother, who suffered from dementia. As a parole, Philip wore a GPS ankle bracelet and was regularly visited by parole officers. On paper, he was being monitored. In reality, he was planning his next crime inside the gray car. That morning, as G walked unsuspectingly up till Nancy Gerio sat in the passenger seat, the couple had been hunting not for directions, but for a victim. They had chosen their location carefully, returning to the same area where Philip had successfully kidnapped before. The moment G approached the car, Philip struck Davis. In his hand was a stun gun, and he used it without hesitation. Jess collapsed unconscious, her small body crumpling as 50 volts coursed through her. Nancy immediately dragged the unconscious child into the car, stripping away her clothes, but leaving only a small butterfly-shaped ring. That G worried as Carl Provin pedaled desperately after them on his bicycle. The gray car was already speeding toward the highway. Inside, Nancy held a blanket over the unconscious child, while Philip drove with the focused determination of a man who had done this before. The 3-hour drive to Antioch gave Jackie time to drift in and out of consciousness. The only words she spoke during the entire journey were a plea born of innocency and desperation. Her parents couldn't afford to pay a ransom. But this wasn't about money. This was about something far more sinister. What Jackie didn't know waste had she was being taken to a house of horrors, a place where reality itself would be twisted beyond recognition. The property at 155 for Walnut Avenue in Antioch looked ordinary from the street, but behind the house lay a secret world that would become her prison for the next 18 years. The Gerio property in Antioch appeared normal to anyone driving past. It was a modest home in an unincorporated area surrounded by other typical suburban houses, but appearances can be deceiving. In behind the main house lay a carefully constructed world of secrets. When a gray car pulled into the driveway, Jackie was still covered by the blanket, barely conscious from the shock of the stun gun. Nancy and Philip carried her to the backyard where they had spent months preparing for this moment. What they had created was a prison disguised as a makeshift campground. The backyard was divided into 2 sections. The front area looked normal enough, a typical suburban space where neighbors might occasionally glimpse the girls going about their daily lives, but the back section was hidden from view, accessible only through a narrow passage concealed by trees and tarps. In this secret area, Philip had constructed a series of ramshackle structures, dilapidated tents, small sheds, and windows that would serve as JC's world for nearly 2 decades. On a particular shed had been specially prepared for this day. It was small, cramped, and had been soundproofed to ensure that no screams could escape. Philip dragged the barely conscious child into this shed and secured it with a heavy bolt. He told her about the Doberman pinchers that supposedly patrolled the area, trained to attack Inyoni who tried to escape. In reality, there were no such dogs, but G had no way of knowing this was just another line. What would become an endless series of deceptions. The shed became G's entire universe. It contained a bucket for her bodily functions, a thin mattress, and little else. She was kept in handcuffs, naked and terrified, visitedly by Philip, who would occasionally bring her fast food and engage in rambling conversations about religion and his twisted worldview. For the first week, Jackie remained chained and confused, had no idea where she was or what had happened to her normal life. The 11-year-old girl who had walked up that hill in her pink outfit was gone, replaced by a terrified child, trying to understand why this was happening to her. But the worst was yet to come. 7 days after kidnapping, Philip entered the shed with a different purpose. What happened next would mark the beginning of a horror that would continue for years. The details are too disturbing to recount fully, but it was the first time Philip forced himself on the child, beginning a pattern of abuse that would continue throughout her captivity. As weeks turned to months, the shed became less of a prison and more of a twisted home. Philip eventually moved G to a slightly larger space. Chaining her to a bed, he would disappear for days at a time on what he called runs, methamphetamine binges that would leave him paranoid and violent. During these drug-fueled episodes, Philip would force G to participate in his delusions. He claimed to hear voices from walls and insisted that she was sent to him by demon angels to help with his sexual problems. He alternated between sobbing apologies and threats to sell her to people who would keep her in a cage. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as the physical abuse. Philip presented himself as both her savior and her tormentor, creating a twisted dependency that would make escape seem impossible, even when opportunities arose. But Jackie wasn't entirely alone in this nightmare. 7 months into her captivity, she would meet the other half of this disturbing partnership, Nancy Grado, the woman who had helped orchestrate her kidnapping and would play a crucial role in maintaining her imprisonment. Sigerio entered G's life like a twisted fairy godmother, bearing gifts of stuffed animals and chocolate milk, but her appearance marked not rescue, but the introduction of a new form of psychological torture. Nancy was not the reluctant accomplice one might expect. She was a willing participant in Philip's crimes, driven by her own jealousy and twisted sense of ownership. When she first met JC, Nancy alternated between motherly concern and cold cruelty, creating a confusing dynamic that would define their relationship for years to come. The woman who worked as a nursing home aide by day became G's second captor by night. Nancy saw the child not as a victim to be pitied, viewed as a rival for Philip's attention. She blamed G for her own predicament as if an 11-year-old child had somehow chosen to disrupt their marriage. Anya's manipulations were subtler, but no less damaging than Philip's direct abuse. She would shower JC with momentary kindness, only to withdraw it without warning. She would express concern for the child's well-being, then participate in maintaining the conditions of her imprisonment. When Philip was briefly returned to prison for failing a drug test, Nancy stepped seamlessly into the role of primary jailer. She proved just as capable of maintaining the psychological control that kept Jesse trapped, demonstrating that the imprisonment was not just one man's obsession, but a shared delusion between two deeply disturbed individuals. As G grew from a child into a teenager in captivity, the Jerios began to construct increasingly elaborate lies about their situation. They told neighbors that G was a relative, explaining away her presence when she was occasionally glimpsed in the backyard. The property itself became more secure over time. Philip built an 8-foot fence around the backyard and installed additional barriers to prevent prying eyes from seeing into their secret world. He set up a tent where G could spend time outside, the first taste of fresh air she had experienced since her kidnapping. But even these small freedoms came with devastating psychological costs. The Jeritos would occasionally give G kittens to care for, allowing her to experience moments of joy and companionship. Then, without warning, the animals would mysteriously vanish, leaving Joshy heartbroken and more isolated than before. The cruelest manipulation came when Philip discovered that G was keeping a journal about the kittens. In this journal, she had written her real name, JC. The first time she had been allowed to use her identity in captivity, Philip forced her to tear out the page containing her name, symbolically erasing her identity and ensuring that she would not speak or write her real name again for the next 18 years. The psychological prison was so complete. Joshy had been stripped not just of her freedom, but of her very identity. She was no longer JC Lee Duggar, the 11-year-old girl who loved pink and was excited about a school field trip. She was whatever the Goros wanted her to be. But the human spirit has a remarkable capacity for survival, and Joshy was about to discover reserves of strength she never knew she possessed, because her greatest challenge was yet to come. 3 years in her captivity, G's body began to change in ways that number 14-year-old should have to endure alone. The Jeritos noticed before she did. Her small body was carrying the consequences of Philip's continued abuse. Easter Sunday 1994 marked a turning point in G's imprisonment. For the first time since her kidnapping, the Doritos gave her cooked food instead of the usual fast food meals. It was a small gesture that carried enormous significance. They were preparing for something when they told her she was pregnant. G's world shifted once again. At 13 years old, she had learned about the connection between sex and pregnancy from television, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of carrying a child while still being a child herself. The Jerios' reaction to the pregnancy revealed the depths of their delusion. Rather than seeing it as evidence of their crimes, they treated it as a blessed event. Philip claimed it was part of God's plan, while Nancy began to see an opportunity to finally have the family she had always wanted. Joshy spent the months of her pregnancy watching television programs about childbirth, trying to prepare herself for something no teenager should face alone. She had no access to medical care, no prenatal vitamins, no doctor to monitor her health or the baby's development. She was entirely dependent on her captors' twisted version of care. On August 18, 1994, at age 14, Joshy gave birth to her first daughter in the backyard compound. The birth took place in one of the makeshift structures, with only Nancy acting as midwife. It was a moment that should have been joyous, but it was overshadowed by circumstances of her captivity. The baby's arrival changed the dynamics of the household. Philip's abuse of Jess became less frequent. Though it never stopped entirely, he claimed to be transformed by fatherhood, but his actions suggested otherwise. He would still force himself on G when he was under the influence of drugs, showing that his proclaimed spiritual awakening was as false as everything else about him. 3 years later, when Joshy was 17, she gave birth to his second daughter on November 13, 1997. This birth would mark the end of Philip's sexual abuse of G, not because he had found morality, but because he had found other ways to control and manipulate her. The children became both G's greatest joy and her strongest chains. They were innocent victims in this nightmare, but their presence made escape seem impossible. How could she run with 2 small children? How could she put them at risk? The Jeritos had created the perfect trap. They had made G's love for her children into another form of imprisonment. But the children also gave G something. She had lost a sense of purpose. She threw herself into protecting them. Using information gleaned from television to guide her parenting, she created a world of love and stability within the nightmare, showing a strength and resilience That would have been impossible to imagine when she was that 11-year-old girl in pink. The Jerios continued their psychological manipulation, forcing Jackie to present herself as the children's older sister rather than their mother. Nancy demanded to be called mom, while Jackie was relegated to the role of big sister. This fiction would be maintained for years, even when the family eventually had contact with the outside world. As their children grew, the backyard compound became their entire universe. They knew no other life, no other family structure to them. This bizarre arrangement, whilst normal, Philip was their father, Nancy was their mother, and Jackie was their older sister, who took care of them. But the outside world was still searching, and the Jerio secret was becoming harder to maintain while G was giving birth and raising children in captivity. The outside world had never forgotten about her. The search for JC Lee Dugard had become one of the most extensive missing person cases in California history. Within hours of her disappearance, local and national media had descended on the small mountain community of Myers. The image of the 11-year-old girl in her pink outfit was broadcast across the nation, and her story was featured on America's Most Wanted. Just for days after a kidnapping to point, JC's mother founded an organization called JC's Hope, which coordinated volunteer efforts and fundraising campaigns. The town of Myers was blanketed in pink ribbons, JC's favorite color, as a constant reminder of her absence and a symbol of hope for Heraldern. Tens of thousands of flyers were distributed across the United States. Cassette tapes of a song called JC Lee were sold, along with t-shirts, sweatshirts, and buttons to raise money for the search efforts. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and Child Quest International joined the effort, bringing national resources to bear on the case. But despite the massive search effort, the investigation was plagued by false leads and missed opportunities. The initial focus fell on JC's stepfather, Carl Probin, and her biological father, Ken Slayton Probin, who had witnessed the abduction, was subjected to polygraph tests and intense scrutiny. Slayton, who had barely known JC existed, was also investigated. Both men were eventually cleared, but precious time and resources had been wasted. The case that had begun with such promise gradually grew cold. Years passed without reliable leads, and constant pressure took its toll on G's family. The stress contributed to the breakdown of Terry and Carl's marriage, adding another layer of tragedy to an already devastated family. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the failed investigation was how close authorities came to discovering JC on multiple occasions. The missed opportunities would later become a source of public outrage and legal consequences for the agencies involved. In April 1992, less than a year after G's kidnapping, a man called the Contralosa County Sheriff's Department from a gas station just 2 miles from the Gario property. He reported seeing a young girl who looked exactly like G, staring intently at a missing child poster of herself. The caller said he saw her leave in a large yellow van, a vehicle that matched one later found on the Gario property. By the time police arrived, the caller, the girl, and the van were gone. The caller never identified himself, and the police did not pursue the matter. This single phone call could have ended G's ordeal. 17 years early, in June 2000, to the Antioch Fire Department responded to a report of a juvenile with a shoulder injury in a swimming pool at the Jerio residence. This information was never relayed to Philip's parole office, which had no record of children living at the address. Another opportunity lost. The most egregious missed opportunity came in 2006 when Antioch, the Doritos neighbors, called 911 to report that there were tents in the backyard with children living in them. Neighbors specifically described Philip as psychotic with sexual addictions. A deputy sheriff visited the property and spoke with Philip at the front door for 30 minutes before leaving, with only a warning about potential deviations for people living outdoors. During a later investigation, it was discovered that a parole agent had encountered a 12-year-old girl at the Jerio home, but accepted Philip's explanation that she was his brother's daughter. The agent did nothing to verify this claim, even though a simple phone call would have revealed that Philip's brother had no children. These failures weren't just bureaucratic incompetence, they represented a systemic breakdown in supervision of a dangerous sex offender. Philip Jerio was a man who should have been under constant scrutiny, but instead, he was allowed to hide in plain sight. Law enforcement officers visited the Jerio residence at least twice during G's captivity, but never to inspect the backyard where she was being held. They never detected the presence of JC or her children. In theory, as they did search, most remarkably, no one connected the dots between Philip's 1976 kidnapping of Catherine Calloway in South Lake Tahoe and JC's 1991 disappearance from the same area, the geographic connection should have made Philip a prime suspect from the beginning. As the years passed, JC's story faded from the headlines. But her family never stopped hoping. They continued to mark anniversaries with candlelight vigils, continued to distribute flyers, and continued to believe that somehow someday Jackie would come home. They had no way of knowing that she was living just 120 miles away, raising two children in a backyard prison, and that her captors were becoming increasingly bold in their interactions with the outside world. Beat to 009. The dynamics of the Jericho household had evolved into something almost unrecognizable. From the original kidnapping, JC, now 28 years old, had spent more than half her life in captivity. Her daughters were 15 and 11, the same age Jackie had been when she was taken. The Garrios had grown increasingly confident in their ability to hide their secret. They had successfully concealed JC and her children for 18 years, weathering multiple visits from law enforcement and maintaining the facade of a normal household. Philip had even begun to involve JC in his printing business, which he operated from the property short as a graphic designer, creating materials for customers who had no idea they were dealing with a kidnapping victim. Ben Dodro, one of Philip's customers, later said he had spoken with Jackie by telephone multiple times and found her work to be excellent. During this period, Jackie had access to business phones and email accounts. She could have reached out for help, could have sent a message to authorities or her family, but the psychological chains that bound her were stronger than any physical restraints. She had been so thoroughly conditioned by 18 years of captivity that freedom seemed more terrifying than imprisonment. The children, meanwhile, were occasionally seen playing in the backyard by neighbors, but they appeared healthy, and normal. Witnesses would later testify that Jackie sometimes answered the front door when people came to the house, but she never indicated there was a problem or attempted to seek help. This apparent normalcy was itself a testament to the insidious nature of long-term psychological abuse. Jackie had created a functioning family unit within the constraints of her captivity, but it was a family built on lies and maintained by fear. The Jericho's confidence was about to become their downfall. Philip, driven by his grandiose delusions and religious obsessions, began to believe that he had been chosen by God for a special mission. He wanted to share his insights with the world, particularly his belief that he had discovered a cure for sexual deviance. This delusion led him to take increasingly dangerous risks. He began to venture out with JC's daughter, sprinting them as his own children and himself as a reformed man, with a message of redemption. The girls, who had never known any other life, went along with these public appearances. Without question, Philip's behavior during these outings was erratic and attention-grabbing. He spoke of divine revelation and claimed to have important information about controlling human impulses to observers. He seemed like a man on the edge of a breakdown, accompanied by the pale, submissive girls who seemed strangely detached from their surroundings. It was this combination of factors, Philip's growing delusions, his need for public validation, and the unusual behavior of the children, that would finally bring the House of Cards stumbling down. On August 24, 2009, Philip made a decision that would end his captivity. He decided to visit the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, accompanied by JC's daughters, with the intention of promoting his God's Desire program. What Philip didn't realize, Waste had his previous conviction as a sex offender, and his current status as a federal parole made him easy to identify. Its authorities began to investigate his paranoid behavior, and the strange demeanor of the children accompanying him immediately raised red flags with campus security. When Philip approached Special Events Manager Lisa Campbell to request permission for a campus event, found his behavior erratic, and the girls sullen and submissive. Something about the interaction troubled her enough that she asked him to return the next day for a formal appointment. That simple request to reschedule would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel 18 years of carefully constructed lies. Officer Allied Jacobs ran a routine background check on Philo and discovered what should have been discovered years earlier, that this man talking about redemption and divine inspiration was a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape. When Philip returned the next day with the two girls, Officer Jacobs was waiting. She noted that the children appeared pale, as if they hadn't been exposed to sunlight, and their behavior struck her as highly unusual. More importantly, she recognized that Philip's presence on campus with minors constituted a parole violation. Jacobs contacted Philip's parole office, leaving a detailed message about her concerns. That phone call would trigger a series of events that would finally bring G home. But even as the net was closing around the Garridos, Jackie herself would prove to be the biggest obstacle to her own rescue. After 18 years of captivity, she had developed what appeared to be a fierce loyalty to her captors, a psychological phenomenon that would both fascinate and trouble those trying to understand her ordeal. Parole agent Edward Santos Jr. received Officer Jacobs' voicemail message about Phillips' suspicious behavior. On the Berkeley campus, Santos had been supervising Philip for years, making regular visits to the Antioch property, but he had never detected anything unusual about the situation. The message from UC Berkeley changed everything. Santos and another parole agent drove to Jerrio House that same evening, arriving to find Philip at home with his wife Nancy and his elderly mother. Agents handcuffed Philip and searched the house, but they found no evidence of the two young girls who had been reported with him on campus. When questioned, Philip claimed that the girls were daughters of a relative and that he had permission from their parents to take them to UC Berkeley. This explanation should have been easy to verify, but Philip's parole supervisors had made the same mistake that law enforcement had been making for years. They accepted his word without conducting a thorough investigation. The parole violations were clear and serious. Philip was not allowed to associate with minors without permission. At Berkeley was well outside the 25 meters radius he was permitted to travel from his home. Despite these obvious violations, the agents drove Philip home and simply ordered him to report to the parole office the next day. For further discussion, this decision would later be criticized as another in a long series of missed opportunities to discover his captivity. Had the agents conducted a thorough search of the property that night, including the concealed backyard areas, they might have ended her ordeal 18 hours sooner. The next morning, August 26, 2009, Philip arrived at the parole office in Concord, California, as ordered. But he didn't come alone. With him were Nancy, the two young girls from UC Berkeley, and a woman he introduced as Alyssa. The parole officer, suspicious of the entire situation, decided to separate Philip from the women and children to question them individually. This decision will prove to be the key that finally unlocked the mystery that had baffled investigators for 18 years. When questioned alone, the woman calling herself Alyssa maintained her false identity, but began to show signs of extreme stress. She claimed that the two girls were her daughters and that she was a battered wife from Minnesota from an abusive husband. Her story was inconsistent, and her behavior increasingly agitated the parole officer. Pressed for details that would confirm her identity, basic information that any person should be able to provide about themselves without difficulty. But Alyssa became extremely defensive and demanded to know why she was being interrogated. The more questions she was asked, the more desperate she became to maintain her false identity. The two girls, meanwhile, echoed their mother's claims. They said Philip was a changed man, a great person who was good with kids. Their responses seemed rehearsed, as if they had been coached to provide these specific answers. The parole officer, recognizing that something was seriously wrong with the situation, called the Concord police for assistance. When a police sergeant arrived and began asking more pointed questions, the careful facade that had been maintained for 18 years finally cracked. Faced with the possibility of serious consequences, Phil Giretto made a decision that would end the charade forever. He confessed to the police sergeant that he had kidnapped and raped the woman they knew as Alyssa Lee. That did J.C. Duggar speak her real name for the first time in 18 years. The moment was both triumphant and heartbreaking. J.C. Lee Duggar, the 11-year-old girl who had disappeared in her pink outfit while walking to a school bus stop, was finally free. But the woman who stood in that parole office bore little resemblance to the child who had been taken. She was 29 years old, the mother of two teenage daughters, and she had spent more than half her life in captivity. The rescue that her family had prayed for had finally come, but it came with complexities that no one had anticipated. G's first reaction was not relief or joy, but fear. She was terrified that her children would be taken from her, that the family unit she had created in captivity would be destroyed by her rescue. She had lived for 18 years in a world where the Jerrios were the only family her daughters had ever known. And the special agent arranged for Jachi to speak by telephone with her mother, Tara Previn. It was a conversation that both women had dreamed of for 18 years, but it was also a conversation that neither of them could have imagined in their worst nightmares. Terry had never stopped hoping for her daughter's return, but she had never imagined that Jachi would return as a mother herself, or that she would have to compete with her daughter's captors for her loyalty and affection. The Doritos were immediately arrested and charged with kidnapping and rape, but as the authorities celebrated successful resolution of one of the most notorious missing person cases in American history, they were beginning to understand That JC's rescue was just the beginning of a much more complex story. The phone call between JC and her mother Terry was 18 years in the making, but nothing could have prepared either of them for the reality of that moment. Terry had dreamed of hearing her daughter's voice again, but the woman on the other end of the line was not the 11-year-old girl who had been taken. Farmer G's voice was that of a stranger, deeper, older, shaped by experiences. Thackeray couldn't begin to understand. When G spoke about her daughters, Terry realized with shock that she was not just welcoming back a daughter, but also meeting granddaughters she never knew existed. The reunion that took place on August 27, 2009 was both joyful and heartbreaking. Terry had spent 18 years imagining this moment, but she had never imagined it would be this complicated. Jachi was no longer the child who had been taken from her. She was a woman who had lived an entire life that Terry knew nothing about. The two girls, aged 15 and 11, were meeting their grandmother. For the first time to them, Nancy Jerrio had been mom, and G had been their older sister. The revelation that Jachi was actually their mother and that Philip was not just their father, but also their captor, was a shock that would take years to process. Jachi retained custody of her children, but the transition to freedom was far from simple. The daughters cried when they learned of Philip's arrest, genuinely mourning the loss of the only father figure they had ever known. They had grown up in the twisted environment of the Jerrio household, where abuse was normalized and their true family history was hidden from them. The public reaction to G's rescue was a mixture of celebration and confusion. How could a kidnapping victim defend her captors? Why hadn't she tried to escape when she had opportunities? The complex psychological dynamics of long-term captivity were difficult for many people to understand. Some observers diagnosed G with Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where hostages develop positive feelings toward their captors, but JC herself rejected this explanation. In a later interview, she said the phrase Stockholm Syndrome implies that hostages cracked by terror and abuse become affectionate towards tired captors. Well, it's really degrading, having my family believe that I was in love with this captor and wanted to stay with him. G's explanation of her behavior was simpler and more heartbreaking. I adapted to survive my circumstance. For 18 years she had done whatever was necessary to stay alive and protect her children. Her apparent loyalty to the Doritos was not evidence of psychological breakdown, but proof of her strength and determination to serve.